Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
Okay, so it's Monday morning, and you're probably just catching up on everything that happened over the weekend, scrolling through the news, and then suddenly you see it, like something that just makes you stop and think, whoa,
Yeah,
this is big.
definitely a big one.
So yeah, today's Monday, April 7th, 2025, and it's one of those days where the news just hits you right between the eyes.
Gets you right where it hurts.
Exactly, and we are diving deep today into something that, honestly, it's already shaking up the global economy, and chances are it's going to have a pretty big impact on your wallet too, and that's President Trump's new tariffs and the European Union's reaction to them.
Yeah, things are moving fast, and we're seeing like a major shift in global trade.
Absolutely. And we've got some really timely insights here from Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, both published just today.
Fresh off the press.
Exactly. And look, our goal here isn't to get bogged down in all the super technical trade jargon or political opinions,
Right, we want to cut through the noise.
Yeah, exactly. We want to give you the essential information from these sources so you can really understand what these tariffs are all about, why they're happening, how the EU is fighting back, and most importantly, what it all means for you, your family, and the global economy as a whole.
The big picture.
The big picture. So let's jump right in. These tariffs, they weren't just announced. They actually went into effect last Wednesday, April 2nd. So what exactly did President Trump put in place?
So as of April 2nd, there is a 10% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S.
Okay, so everything across the board.
Across the board, and then on top of that, there are higher tariffs on specific things like steel and aluminum imports. Those are hit with a 25% tariff. And then get this, coming up this Wednesday, April 9th, there's a massive 20% tariff that's going to be slapped on most goods coming from the EU.
Whoa. Okay, that's a pretty big change. And according to our sources, what's the official reason for all of this?
Well, the administration is calling it a national emergency, and they're saying it's all about reducing the U.S. trade deficit. The idea is that these tariffs will encourage companies to make things here in the U.S. and, lessen our dependence on imports.
A national emergency for trade deficits.
Yeah.
That's not really the usual playbook, is it? Does that mean they're taking a more aggressive approach?
It's definitely not the standard procedure. I mean, there are legal ways to put tariffs in place for national security or, to stabilize the economy. But using this national emergency declaration for a trade deficit shows just how serious they are about this, and they're not afraid to use their power.
Yeah, reading these reports, it feels like this is way more than just adjusting some numbers.
Absolutely.
It feels like it could really change how global trade has worked for decades. That
Right.
whole system that was built after World War II based on open trade.
Exactly. For decades, the trend has been towards, breaking down trade barriers and building more interconnected economies around the world. These tariffs are a huge step away from that. It's a real shift towards protectionism.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so the tariffs are in effect, and they're not messing around. Now let's see how the other side of the Atlantic is reacting. The EU is definitely not just going to sit back and take this. What are they planning to do about it?
They're not taking it lying down. They're getting ready to fight back. According to a leaked document from Reuters, the EU is proposing a 25% tariff on a bunch of American goods. Things like diamonds, eggs, poultry, and those could go into effect around May 16th. Then later in the year, December 1st, they're also proposing a 25% tariff on U.S. almonds and soybeans.
Diamonds, eggs, poultry, almonds, soybeans. It sounds like they're picking their targets very carefully. The Wall Street Journal calls this initial response a careful jab. What's the strategy here? Why not just hit back with the same tariffs on steel and aluminum?
Well, the Wall Street Journal suggests that the EU is trying to inflict some economic pain, but without starting an all-out trade war.
Yeah, like a warning shot.
Yeah, exactly. And think about it. Diamonds, they're a luxury good, right? So targeting them is symbolic. It shows they're not happy, but it doesn't immediately impact everyday essentials for people. Then going after agricultural products like those eggs, poultry, almonds, and soybeans, well, that could really put pressure on specific farming states in the U.S. And that might lead to some political pressure on the Trump administration from within the U.S. It's a very calculated move. Respond, but don't escalate things to the same level just yet.
Makes sense, trying to apply pressure strategically.
Uh-huh.
And we even have a direct quote here from the EU trade boss, Maroza Ficovic. He says, "We'd rather negotiate, but we won't wait forever." That's pretty clear, isn't it?
Crystal clear.
Yeah.
It shows they're open to talking things out, but they're also not going to just stand by and let these U.S. tariffs hurt them indefinitely.
Right, but this raises a big question, doesn't it? Could President Trump see this measured response as a sign of weakness and then decide to push even harder with more tariffs?
That's the worry. A stronger response right off the bat might have been seen differently. This more restrained approach could unfortunately embolden the U.S. to take even more protectionist measures. It's a really tough balancing act.
All right, so we've got the U.S. tariffs in place, and the EU's counter-tariffs are on the table. Now let's talk about what this means in the real world for the markets and for our own wallets. The reports today are painting a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, they are. According to Reuters, global stock markets took a big hit today, Monday the 7th. And the fear index, which basically measures how anxious investors are while it's showing signs of panic, that kind of immediate reaction from the market shows just how worried people are about these trade developments.
It's not just stocks, right? We're seeing the value of currencies change too. The euro seems to be gaining on the dollar.
That's right. The euro is up 1.7% against the dollar. That can have a few different effects. For example, it could make European goods cheaper for U.S. consumers in the short term, but then again, those new tariffs could cancel that out. It also makes U.S. goods more expensive for European buyers.
But the long-term effects seem much more troubling, especially when you look at specific industries and big companies. There are reports about the potential negative impact on giants like Apple and GM. How are companies like that likely to be affected?
Companies like Apple and GM, they have these complex global supply chains, so they're especially vulnerable to tariffs. When the cost of imported parts goes up, it puts pressure on their profits. They might have to make a tough choice, either absorb those higher costs, which hurts their bottom line, or pass those costs on to us, the consumers, by raising prices.
And those higher prices. The Wall Street Journal has this really shocking prediction. They say the next iPhone could cost something like $2,300 because of these supply chain problems. That's a massive jump.
It's a huge increase, and it really shows how much prices could go up on everyday things. If these tariffs mess up existing supply chains, the cost of making things goes up, and that means the price we pay as consumers goes way up too. And this isn't just about fancy electronics. It could affect cars, appliances, even groceries as these tariffs ripple through the economy.
So basically, we're talking about higher prices for all sorts of things hitting our wallets directly. And then there are the bigger economic concerns mentioned in these reports, things like a recession or even stagflation. Those are serious threats. Could you explain what stagflation is?
Stagflation is a really tough economic situation. It's basically when you have rising prices, inflation at the same time as slow or no economic growth, and often high unemployment. It's a nightmare to deal with because the usual solutions for inflation can actually make unemployment worse and vice versa.
And this isn't just a US-EU issue, is it? Our sources, and looking at the bigger picture, show us that other major players in the world are reacting to President Trump's actions as well.
Absolutely. China, which is already facing a 34% U.S. tariff, has said they'll take tough countermeasures. So it looks like things are going to escalate even further there. Canada has already slapped about $20 billion worth of tariffs on U.S. goods in response to earlier trade moves. And even Japan, a major economic partner, their Nikkei stock market is down more than 3% and they're in negotiations. So this is a global reaction, not just a fight between two countries.
It's like a chain reaction of retaliation. And the Wall Street Journal is specifically warning about the possibility of stagflation here in the U.S., rising prices and job losses at the same time. That's a pretty scary thought.
It is. The concern is that these tariffs, while they're meant to protect U.S. industries, could actually end up hurting them because the cost of materials goes up and overall demand goes down. And then when other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, it makes it harder for U.S. businesses to export their goods, which could lead to job losses in those sectors.
And on a fundamental level, it seems like these actions are really undermining the whole system of global trade that's been in place for decades, a system built on rules and agreements. Now it feels more like a power struggle with every country doing its own thing.
That's a key point. The global trade order was built on this idea of rules-based interactions, which created predictability and stability. These unilateral tariffs, they risk destroying that system, and that could lead to a much more fragmented and unstable global economy in the long run.
So let's recap where things stand on this Monday, April 7th, 2025. We are looking at a very real chance of a major global trade war. President Trump's tariffs were the first move, shaking things up, and the EU's proposed counter-tariffs are the first big response.
And as we've talked about, the consequences for you, the listener, are pretty serious. You're likely to see higher prices on a whole range of everyday things, from electronics to food. And all this economic uncertainty, it could hurt businesses and maybe even lead to job losses, which, of course, affects everyone's financial security.
And from what we've seen in these sources, there's no clear sign of how this will all get resolved or even what a possible solution might look like. It feels like we're at the start of something very unpredictable.
I'd say that's a fair assessment. The situation is changing constantly, and the final outcome will depend on what a lot of different global players decide to do. The fact that there's no clear path forward is definitely contributing to all the nervousness in the market and the general economic uncertainty we're seeing.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the initial fallout from President Trump's tariffs and the EU's response, it's pretty clear that the stakes are incredibly high, not just for the global economy, but for each and every one of you listening. It really makes you think, given the very real threat of a global recession and all this disruption to trade relationships that have shaped the world for decades, what kind of long-term adjustments do you think people and countries need to be considering? This goes beyond just prices going up at the store. What are the bigger implications that we should be thinking about as this situation unfolds?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What does this mean for the future?
What does it all mean?
How do we adapt?
Exactly.